So hey, it looks like we're live. Good morning. I don't know if you meant to run music or not. That's okay. I actually can't hear you right now.
No, because I muted because I was running
Oh,
music.
okay. I got you. So good morning, everybody. I was checking to see if the stream went live, and then I saw us, and I said, "Oh,
Yeah, Rich hit
that
the
wasn't
button.
what I expected." But
I
that's
hit the
okay.
button and forgot to switch the scene. That's my bad.
That's all right. Um, I'm not sure if Twitch figured it out, but maybe it did. Looks like it did. All right, everybody. Welcome to the Dev Talk Show. It's March 20th. Is March 20th the first day of spring this year?
Actually, that was yesterday.
Was it yesterday? Wow, is the 19th is that like super early?
It feels early, but Easter's early too, right? I mean, Easter's 2 weeks away, or another week
Yeah.
when we get to the weekend. But yeah, it's so. If I understand celestially,
Yeah, look at
spring
that. You're
start
right.
of spring is defined by the equal amounts of day and night, which is what we
Yeah.
had yesterday.
Right, I guess so. And
And
it says here 11:06 p.m.
there you go.
March 19th. And like you said, I don't know how you calculate the date, but yes, nearly equal portions of day and night. Okay, sure.
And locally, we see it by the long line of people outside one of the big water ice places because they give away free water ice on the first day of spring. So that's all I knew.
That's how you knew. Interesting. Yeah. I guess I just didn't go by a place. But you're right. I forgotten that when they open, everybody gets free water ice, which
Yeah.
that's definitely. I don't know how East Coast that is. Definitely a Philly thing.
Oh,
I'd never
absolutely.
heard. Yeah, I never heard the term until I came out here.
Water ice?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it looked like a snow cone, but I know it's not a snow cone. So nobody
Yes.
from Philly, don't worry.
Snow
I
cone is very
understand.
different.
I understand the difference. But the first time you see it, you go, "Oh, that's
Sure.
kind of like a snow cone,"
Yeah.
and then you find out that no, it's not.
I think the more universal term is Italian ice,
Okay, yeah, that's
possibly.
maybe. Yeah, I have
Although that
seen
might
that.
have local connotations as well.
I don't know, but so I thought of it when I saw the 19th. Like I saw people talking about, oh, first day of spring. I said, really? It's the 19th, and it's not tomorrow. But here we are. It is spring
It is.
in and we're live on the Dev Talk Show. So
Yeah.
as the title suggests, we're going to talk about authentication in Blazor, and there's the authentication story in Blazor 8 is component based.
Mm-hmm.
So when you create a new project and you say you want the individual accounts type, you get all this code. We've covered that before.
Yep.
It might even be interesting to cover it again, but
Sure.
we've covered all of that before. I don't remember what time frame that we did it. I don't remember if it was a preview or if it was like right when it came out. And that gets a lot of attention because this is a really important part of people's projects that I think diving into is kind of tough. But before we get started today, so folks who are watching in the future, there is a news item we're going to cover, right? And then we'll take a look at this.
Let's see. Come on. There we go. There we are. So, sorry, I've been playing around with... I can't do this here. So, I have a little teleprompter here that has our pictures in it so I can kind of see what's going on. And when I want to do funny things like share my screen, I'm actually looking across my my space at it. So that's kind of interesting. And it's being challenging. Sorry, I should have done this beforehand. Let's share that. Awesome.
Yeah, that's interesting because I hadn't mentioned it to you, but I said I figured we would talk about this sooner or later.
Yeah, and you saw it. It's public, right?
Yep.
This is the thing that kind of because this was something that we saw as a result of during Summit last week. I heard about this, and I talked to people internally about it, but this is a video up on the .NET channel, and it is a video by, and I'm going to turn the volume down here because video won't come across it.
Shades of the Blazor United video of last year.
I know,
Here
right?
is Steve Sanderson saying, "I've got something else."
Yep. And what's really cool is, you can certainly go, we'll put a link to the video in the chat and you can watch it. It's an awesome video that shows something that he is describing here. And there's a GitHub repo as well, which is also public, right? I'm doing this in a private browser. We can see this. I'm just covering my butt. That's all.
No, I understand. For people who don't understand, like, Rich, you're a Microsoft employee, and I'm a Microsoft MVP, which means I'm not an employee. So the term is confusing.
Sure.
So I'm not an employee, but still, I'm very grateful that Microsoft has recognized what are called community contributions. In working at the user group, doing this show, just kind of spreading the word about things, and sometimes. And some of people watching may know this. Sometimes when you work at Microsoft or for a variety of reasons, you may hear about something and you are under a non-disclosure, not to talk about it until you're told that it's okay.
Right.
The other way that it can kind of be okay is, well, not kind of. The other way that it can be okay is like it's been publicly announced.
Yeah.
And so I totally get where you're coming from. Is I just want to make sure that everyone saw this, right? And it's not my imagination. Because when I'm logged into things, that login can basically say, "Oh, well, you're allowed to see this."
Yes.
But does that mean everyone else is allowed to see it? So just want to be careful. But yeah, I saw this video publicly. It's on YouTube, on the .NET channel. This is as public as can be. So I was absolutely just said, here we go. This really feels like, again, here's Steve, who, how many times does he show up and say, "I've got something for you"?
Exactly.
He's so interesting. So I'm sure he loves where you froze as well. But, but even zooming ahead, you'll see what this is about. I figured we might try to bring this down on a show very soon.
Yeah, definitely.
It's a repo we can bring down and work with, right?
Yep. And so the video's out there. We'll put a link in the chat. But the important thing with what this is, and we've done, the Hello Dolly app has done a number, we've connected to AI, essentially, large language models, generative AI, and built an application that surfaces that up to the end user. What Steve and his team have put together here is a collection of things called a smart component. And what's really awesome is that all of the work that we did on the show to kind of make the connection, even though we were using something that helped us with the framework of semantic kernel, it was still challenging to understand what's going on when it came to token size and the right type of models to be using and all of those things. And then how to wire that all up and show it in the UI. What this is essentially a way to kind of even abstract some of that capability and just provide some components or some controls that you can bring into your application. So, and this works for Blazor. They are working on some MVC and some Ranger pages for this too. But essentially, there's three main controls in these components. There's a smart paste, so being able to take a copy of a username or user and an email, like we see here in this, or user and an address, as we see in this email that Steve's doing here, and basically dropping that in and have it go into the right locations, which is pretty awesome, right? Instead of having to tediously either manually type those in or go back and forth between copying and pasting for each individual field. So that right off the bat is kind of worth the worth the weight of pulling down the repository, essentially. Smart text area is a way of, based on, a business role where you're typing information or responding to people about, in this case, vacation. It pulls information from, in this case, your vacation policy about how many how many vacation days you get as a full-time employee, and then helps you get the link to that policy. So it does a lot of text suggestion as you're going through this, instead of just giving you a blank text area and let you come up with those on your own. And then the last one that's in here is Smart Combo Box. And it's funny, I was doing this yesterday for our expense system, where I was trying to figure out, in this thing I was submitting, it was, related to cell phone charges, and I was trying to figure out, well, which categories does this go into, and I couldn't find the one that was mobile charges, and it took forever I had to go back to a previous expense report and figure out where it was. And that's what the Smart Combo Box gives you, is essentially the ability, you start typing in your nomenclature what it is you're trying to do, and it gives suggestions for what might be the appropriate category here that you want to include in the drop down list. So I think all of these are really awesome when it comes to making your application smarter and making it much easier for your end user to just get data entry done. So I said a lot there. I'm sure there are questions.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to walk through it.
The
video's there. Like I said, I don't know that it's in any chats right now, but it certainly it can be. And then I know we'll get it added to the YouTube video, but it's really interesting, I think, and that'll be kind of fun to play with. So
yeah,
I don't remember if the price of admission was like an OpenAI key, which
you probably,
I think you just get from their website. But you know what? I don't want to speculate too much without having really jumped into it. So
yeah. So here's the a section here on how to configure the OpenAI backend. So kind of running through those steps there. So yeah, you do need some kind of generative AI to help you through the working of this.
Yeah, I think it's important. Yeah. The last thing that's important to add is that it says it right there in the title, right? I'm pretty sure that it's an experiment.
Yeah, absolutely. Much like other things that come out early. Yeah. So it's just and that's why it's open source GitHub repo. Give it a look-see. Throw your comments in there. There are already some issues that are starting to drop in place here. Use this as an opportunity to maybe jump in and do some open source type work.
Yeah, but I mean, like in other situations, features like this have been announced as experiments, where the team is saying, "We'll see how this goes." Blazor itself was one of these experiments. We'll see how it goes. Maybe it'll ship. Maybe it won't. Just depends on what the feedback is. Depends on if it meets people's needs. Does it actually help? And if it does, then great. So
cool.
So yeah, that is pretty cool. I'm glad we talked about that, because I thought it was interesting, and I knew it would come up sooner or later. I just didn't know if you'd seen it. We haven't gotten a chance to catch up. Rich and I haven't, at least offline. You would think that with the obvious polished production quality of the show, that we must be behind the scenes for hours every day, planning every moment of it.
Right.
But no,
especially given the way we started.
Yeah, and I say everybody who knows the show knows that quite frankly, it really is quite often just hitting the live button and saying we'll either figure it out together as developers, or we'll figure out that we couldn't figure it out today. Which I know for people watching, we try to be very transparent about what we know is going to work that day. Some days I think more prepared than others, and that way your time is valuable. But the other people have told us they like watching the experimentation, so you get a different point of view. So what I am going to do, I was debating whether to do this command line or in Visual Studio, and when I say command line, I mean essentially everything but the Visual Studio IDE. Right. That could mean developing in Linux with Visual Studio Code, or even on Windows with Visual Studio Code, and there's other IDEs, other editors. I think it would be fascinating to kind of get NeoVim going, just to see it work. And for me, it's just to drive the point home that unlike previous iterations of frameworks that we've had in the Microsoft space for years, I can go all the way back. Go to early .NET to heck, even later .NET, VB6, go back to Visual C++. You were married to an ecosystem of operating system tooling It all integrated. And it's the opposite now, where certainly the integration is great, but frankly, under the hood, Visual Studio is using the same tools you do if you're doing this with the .NET CLI, or if you're in Linux or something like that. So what I have, let's see. There we go. That worked.
Nice.
And then maybe I feel like I don't remember if we get slightly more screen real estate. I don't know that we do. Maybe we don't. It's hard to say. Well, there we get a lot. Look at that.
Yeah, there you go.
So that's one way to do it. So in any case, here's Visual Studio. It's happening to tell me that it's 17.9. And the reason why we're going to start with this is we are going to create a new project and purposely we'll call it Blazor Auth from scratch. And it's because I want everyone to see the choices. So we are going to choose authentication type none.
Mm-hmm.
We'll go ahead and configure for HTTPS. I don't think that's too much of a problem. And then interactive render mode is also going to be none. So we're going to have to add in an interactive render mode. But for now, this is the server-side rendered Blazor, which I think one of the biggest transitions for Blazor, in my opinion, is that server-side rendering is now the foundation. I don't know that that's really the case for prior Blazor, because I mean, we could probably really break that down and have a long conversation about it. But previously, you always picked whether you were WebAssembly hosted or what was called Blazor server hosted, the SignalR based round tripping. And now, while you can choose that, you're no longer locked in. And to me, the foundation is server-side rendering. So when you say interactive render mode none, authentication type none, I'm getting a project that, quite frankly, I think it could be confusing to a lot of viewers, because they say, here's some things they might say. I thought Blazor was WebAssembly. Well, I mean, it can be.
Right.
But even to this day, as we went through 5, 6, 7, I would often hear, well, Blazor's WebAssembly, right? And it's like, well, it can be if that's the hosting model you choose. Hosting model might not be the exact correct term, but you always, in prior versions of Blazor, you had to pick, am I Blazor WebAssembly? Am I Blazor server? And now, as we've talked about on the show, you don't have to pick. You can. And it actually makes there are many scenarios where it makes good sense to make that choice and just say, like, listen, I love what I'm doing here in Blazor, but I know I'm a Blazor server app, and that's what I am. That's fine. That's great. And I think it just points out that there's flexibility that we might not be used to.
Right.
And that Blazor has always been more than just how it's hosted. It is first and foremost a component framework rather than a page-based framework or a controller-based framework, which is what we've had in ASP.NET Core until now. Well, until Blazor. So, because I created what you might consider a bare bones looking project, my program CS is very short, and it adds Razor components, and then it builds that. And then we've got some stuff here just in case we're in development, so that way the error page comes up. And we're basically almost there. I mean, we can serve static files, we can redirect to HTTP, and then anti-forgery. This anti-forgery pattern will help us with our forms. If we create forms in our app, those forms will use the anti-forgery token pattern, which is to prevent cross-site request forgery. That's pretty common web pattern. So you just get it all, right? We
I
can
mean,
look
you
at
have the flexibility to bring in what you want, which is cool.
I can, right, which I
Right.
don't know that we will do today, but maybe.
Mm-hmm.
So homepage is pretty bare bones. I did not say to include the sample pages. So I don't have the counter app, the little counter piece.
Oh yeah, yeah.
You know what? Did I
Or the
say to
weather.
include the sample pages? Maybe I did. I don't remember now. I don't remember. But the point is that this particular, we've got 2 quick pages here. When I just run it, you get that default look and feel that comes with the Blazor templates, which you had worked to strip out in Hello Dolly, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think when I dropped mine in, I did not include any of those pages in there, and then continued to pull some of the things out I knew I didn't need.
Right. And so if you haven't seen this before, this sample, there's not a whole lot going on here. This weather page, it looks like it's loading from an API. It turns out that it's not, but it is simulating it. And they simulate that in the code behind, basically. So it is not actually going to get weather data, but it pretends that it did. And that is to demonstrate stream rendering, which we used on the last show we were together, to reduce both kind of that flicker feel and that double. What was it? It was grabbing data like twice for you, right? It was.
Yeah, and I think part of that. So streaming was part of that, but I think there's also, and we didn't touch on this, but there's also that pre-render.
Pre-rendering, yeah, right.
Which
so
I don't think we turned off, but yeah,
we might have. I don't remember. So that's something that really confuses people too.
Sure.
Blazor, at its core, at the foundation, is a server rendered framework now. That's kind of an okay statement to make, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And what that means is that even when you choose interactive server or interactive WebAssembly, Blazor will still try to get HTML and CSS without interactive hookup, or without interactive linking, or the code that drives that stuff. It just wants to get it out there. And it can create a situation where if in your component, especially in the early methods of the lifecycle, if you are doing a lot of work, for example, you're calling an API and it's not super instant, and you can get this flickering feel because it'll call it and then it'll render and then it'll call it again, because now it's setting up the circuitry for WebAssembly or SignalR.
Right.
So the way to get around that is no pre-render. We're not dealing with any of that right now. We have a server-side page. So in a server-side page, we still have access authentication-wise. And if I think that's just, I don't know if my screen, if the page flickers when I.
No, it's been looking good. Well, that
it doesn't. Okay, because I'm wondering if. So what happens there is, and I don't know if there's a way to shut this off, because for streaming I might want to do it. But when you go down to your toolbar in Windows and you pick a window, it like wants to preview that window for you, and it shuts everything. It turns off all the other windows, and so it looks like, oh, what happened to the screen? So I understand.
Okay.
Kind of, that's kind of a mess, I suppose. But let's see now. One of the things that we can do, let me just is we haven't added any code yet, like at all.
Right.
For any kind of authentication, like nothing. So, part of what we're trying to do is see if we can add this stuff back in a little bit at a time. And that way that we all get a better understanding of how this actually works.
Mm-hmm.
So normally I don't think, nobody is saying that normally this is how things would work, but on the home page, what I'm going to do now, the home page is a component, just like any other component, but it's a page component. So in a way, it's already kind of, this can only be used as something that you navigate to. So I'm going to inject this authentication state provider. And as you can see, it immediately said, like, hold on a second, you're not able to do that. And the reason is because it says, well, wait a second, are you missing assembly reference? And I think we're going to get some help here. If I just say quick actions of refactoring, yes, we got the help that I was expecting, where it says, this is probably the using statement you're looking for.
Okay.
And that's true. It was right. So the authentication state provider, this is it's in the components namespace. Microsoft ASP.NET Core. Let's see. I'm trying to get better at using Zoom It here.
Ah, nice.
So it's in Microsoft ASP.NET Core components. Now, if you've ever tried diving into the ASP.NET Core open source project out on GitHub, maybe just because you want to build it yourself or you're thinking about contributing, which we certainly have, components is the namespace where Blazor lives. Kind of. Like it's pretty close enough for our purposes. So this is clearly the Blazor folks saying, well, we're going to need a way to go get authentication state of the current user, because previously what I think people are used to doing is using the HTTP context. And so let's go ahead and open a code block. And oh, I love how it's already trying to guess at what I want next. It's actually not all that far off. But in the server side parts of Blazor, you are still allowed to use HTTP context, but I kind of don't want to jump into that just yet. Instead, I think what I want to do here is say, okay, I want to look at the current user principal, and so let's try this. It's interesting. Why is it? Because I'm trying to think if I need, in order for IntelliSense not to completely fight me. Let me think for a second. I don't know that this needs to be asynchronous just yet, but we'll create an on-initialized, and I don't think it's going to fight me anymore now, because the var keyword outside of a method, like, it isn't valid. So IntelliSense comes in and tries to help you, right? It says, oh, maybe you mean you want this class. So, but this is what I really wanted to get to, is that now that we have an injected authentication state provider, we can say, what's the current user's authentication state? So why do we need to do this? And the main reason is because we're in a component-based framework now. Components can be ignorant of the page that they're living in, the context they're living in. It's not like our previous frameworks where, well, other frameworks, because they're not previous, they still work. Razor Pages and MVC, they are server-side frameworks. So no matter where you're writing code in Razor Pages and MVC, that code is getting executed on the server, and therefore HTTP context is valid.
Right.
But what if you're in WebAssembly? Is HTTP context valid when you are client-side code running in the client? And is it valid when you're a component? So, yeah, go ahead.
Those are good. Those are good questions and things to think and frame your thought process as you're laying out your application and figuring out, which side of those render modes you're running in.
That's interesting. That's interesting. Why? I'm not sure why it's oh, I know why. I know the reason why. So what's the bug that I just created here, which is great. This is some good async await thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So AuthState has a user, and I'm like, why can't I just reach user? And first of all, why did IntelliSense say to get the result? That sounds like a task. It's like, oh, I know why. This is an async method, and I didn't await it.
Yeah.
Now, if I'm going to await it, now I've got this whole new issue where, hold on a second, I overrode the non-async version of this.
Yep.
So this returns a task. Is that right?
Yes.
Maybe I got to do more.
You still got to do the await, right?
That's what I did wrong. Okay. So, and then I think this has to be async.
There you go. The async part. Yes.
All right. So these are all the things that has to happen. And that changed a few things. Instead of just simply calling on initialize, the base method, now that's also awaitable. So this has to be called correctly. All right.
Yeah. And I
don't know that
do
I even
have one.
to call it at all, do I? Actually, maybe what I really want to do is this.
So I'll give 2 comments. I did not. So we did something very similar in the Hello Dolly app. If you may, I did not call back to base.
Okay.
For whatever reason. And then the other thing is at line 12, for some reason, something comes down later on where it actually needed to be protected override async.
Oh, okay.
Instead of async override. I'm sure there's.
Oops. So yeah, we may not really need this. So the point is, if we don't do anything else but just run this, we really shouldn't expect a whole lot here because, well, we're not logged in.
Nothing's authenticated. Yeah.
Yeah. So I need to. Oh, okay. Well, this is good actually. So this blows up, and it says. No, but you did. There's no authentication state provider registered, which is a good point because we didn't register one.
Yep.
So let's now the trick is figuring out what do you actually register. So, and this is where it gets a little tricky. This isn't the same thing as when you're using MVC and you're doing the identity components and you haven't done like the add authentication extension method. This isn't quite the same thing.
Okay.
We need a service of some kind. Like, for example, see, it's even trying to say, well, you must want add authentication, right? This is to say we need a component-based authentication state service.
Okay.
One that will allow when you inject when you use dependency injection and components on your own, you had to register a service for dependency injection, which you did in the Hello Dolly app.
Yep, absolutely. Did a couple.
We need something like that because we're sitting over here in home.razor saying, hey, go inject this authentication state provider. And then dependency injection looked at this stuff and said, you never registered one. But instead of having to register it in like the very base foundational way where we would actually add and say, hey, resolve this to this, there is an extension method already out there, add cascading authentication state. And if I hit F12, it moves us into it. Now this might look a little familiar, I don't know, where this might look like when you do register services using the services get service or add service. Here it's saying, hey, your authentication state provider is a required service of type authentication state provider. And then they have this way where they return a cascading value source, which is a cascading value source is something in Blazor that you can create that basically tells Blazor, I have a value source that I want components underneath me to be able to inject and receive value from, so that when I update that source, they get updated as well.
Yep.
So, creating your own cascading value source is certainly a topic of a show, but we can kind of take a look at what's happening here. I am not going to pretend that I understand all of this yet, but certainly have been working on it.
And
yeah.
And just to take a step back, when we think about cascading value source and your application, I mean, the number of times, or I guess the context of when you might do something like that is something that's more global to your application, like a user or like an authentication piece, right? You wouldn't necessarily do it for, like we were doing, we're passing the answers of a question, right? That's not, the scope of what you're trying to accomplish is very different in a cascading value versus maintaining something in state.
Right. Exactly. So the cascading value and the cascading parameter concept in Blazor, as it says here, is provide a convenient way to flow data down a component hierarchy from an ancestor to any number of descendants. In this case, what's happening is a cascading value is being added to the root component. And that's what that extension method is essentially doing. Is it saying, I'm putting this at the top of the hierarchy, so everything benefits from it.
Yep.
To your point, like it says here, you can create something at a root level, and then they have all kinds of examples in this particular piece of documentation where they say, okay, so now you can see that other the descendant components, they get to just basically say, hey, I what's the cascading parameter, and it picks it up for it. And then they even go on to talk about what we're not going to really jump into is creating cascading value sources. And so that's what is happening here. Is they are creating they're essentially saying, we're going to create a top level cascading value. Everybody gets the benefit from it. And it happens to be the authentication state provider.
Mm-hmm.
If the authentication state changes, then they have events that deal with that. And what happens is there's a handler that basically calls notify change to sync. And that is essentially that's what's going to trigger in Blazor calling down to the components and saying, hey, guess what? That auth changed. So go ahead.
It's almost like a pub sub without having to wire all that up, right? You get it for free because you're doing a cascading value.
Right. So the tricky part is understanding that this extension method is doing more than just registering the service that you need here so that you can use dependency injection. It's doing a little bit more. It's setting it up as a cascading value source at the very top so that you just don't have to really think about it. That's the idea.
Okay.
And with that convenience, unfortunately, you also have the issue of like, well, I don't understand what it's doing. So let's see, is there anything else that we need to do? Because if I run it now, I'm not 100% sure if we're completely done. So we're going to find out, though. So last time, I think we got a different exception. No service for type ASP.NET Core Components Authorization Authentication State Provider has been registered. It's like, okay.
And that sounds similar to what we got the last time.
Right.
Okay.
But it's a little different.
But it's different. Though. Yeah.
Yeah. And so now the trick is saying, okay, so what now is it looking for? So that it'll say, okay, I mean, we have add cascading authentication state,
Mm-hmm.
but what I have had trouble figuring out next is what do you add here so that this is registered for purposes of being picked up in an underlying call, right?
Right.
Let's see, did I do this wrong? No, that's the name is that, right? So that's correct. This is not a class name, which can be very confusing because this looks like a class name,
Sure.
but it's not. And probably the best way to demonstrate that is what if I change this to say Auth state provider? Now it's not happy because it's like, wait a second, you can't call that method from a class name. You need an instance. It just so happened that the instance was named identically.
Mm.
So you change that a little bit. Maybe that provides a little more clarity. I actually kind of like this.
Okay.
I understand if not everyone does, but I like that for clarity's sake. So the next place that I want to double check here is I'm wondering if there are imports that are missing, and there just really aren't. Because if you create this on your own, if you basically say, hey, I want to do the same exact thing, but I just don't see any. I'm trying to figure out what is exactly missing here. It's not that. I don't know if we are missing NuGet packages.
Okay.
I feel like we would get a different error if it was NuGet, though.
You would have issues with it compiling even.
I think so. Right. So I don't think that that's it either. So we have program CS and CS. We did say add cascading authentication state and then builder.build. Okay. Use anti-forgery, use static files, use HTTP directions. So I'm a little bit at a loss as to why this did not register that. Add razor components. We don't need to do anything else. Let me see. Is it here in home.razor? We don't need to change the render mode. We don't need to change yeah, so this is where I'm at a loss as to why we can't go any further, because I feel like that's it. That I feel like there isn't anything more.
Sorry, let me come off mute. Let's take a step back.
Oh, okay.
When we look at your programs .cs and what we're wiring up over there, because that's going to set the stage for what we can call in here. We have cascading authentication state. We don't have anything that tells, and maybe this is the path we need to go. There's nothing that tells Blazor or your application, regardless of Blazor, how do I do authentication? Am I talking to, a local collection of user and password? Am I using some kind of an identity provider? There's nothing that really wires that up. And I think that's kind of what we're missing here.
Yep. Unfortunately, the project that I'm copying it off of doesn't have anything else. So I don't know where it comes from. And that's been a lot of the struggle, is trying to figure out what's the missing piece. Now, this happens to be an interactive server app, and I certainly hope that that's not the case, that you cascading authentication state. I'm not quite sure why that wouldn't work with server-side rendering, because you still have components in server-side rendering.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't feel like that's it. I believe that because we're on server side, I think you can do things like get HTTP context.
Right. Definitely.
And you can even have it injected.
Yep. Because you can get that as a cascading parameter, essentially.
Yeah. The problem I have with this method is this only works server side.
Yeah. So it's a limited architecture use case.
Right. Meaning that if we create a WebAssembly component, this stops working.
Yep. Yep. Because it
comes back null, right?
Yes. Because it has no context. It's not running in the browser per se. Does it make sense maybe to go down the path of, hey, how do we wire up client side, or maybe just server side Blazor authentication, or since we know there's a limitation because of the context, do we focus on doing maybe the client side part and just look at the docs to kind of wire that up? And what we're trying to do here, just to kind of give a sense, yes, we could, as Chris kind of kicked off, we could do file new project and say, hey, let's bring in authentication. Boom. But what if you've got an application that, and think about what we did with Hello Dolly. We didn't start off with any authentication, but I want to get it in there. How do we go ahead and do that? So we're kind of walking through those steps based on the type of app we got and the type of authentication we want to include. And this is just some of the thought process that we're going through kind of live here because we're figuring it out as we go. So we don't necessarily have a direct answer. We've got some thoughts, and we've got some docs. And I think that's kind of the path we're heading down. And just to kind of level set, we might get a good ways for the next 20 minutes, and we might get to a point where, hey, this is as far as we can get today, and we'll come back tomorrow. But
so I'm going to try adding something, because I don't know if this. I've got a funny feeling about this though. So this is interesting. Is this really? Huh. See, this all lights up.
That's a component?
So AuthorizeView is a built-in component that you get in Blazor.
Okay.
And this is the probably the foundational way that in your components, in this case a page, but in your components, you can decide what gets rendered if the user is authorized to view this page, which is different from authenticated, and what gets rendered if the user is not authorized. Okay.
Little conditional.
So this is not code that we wrote.
Right.
In fact, you can see right there that it comes in. But what's interesting about it is that the authorized view it's directly referring to a context.
Interesting.
But we haven't declared this context anywhere.
True.
And yet it's still wired up and still works. So I still feel like that's not as far as we want to go, though, because I believe it was complaining. Yeah, see, what it complains about is that AuthenticationStateProvider, AuthorizationAuthenticationStateProvider has been registered. No service for type AuthenticationStateProvider has been registered. But what I thought is I said, okay, is it possible that that doesn't make any sense that it would go back and register something? That doesn't make any sense to me at all.
Right.
But I was kind of hoping there that maybe.
So when we added that cascading value, was that an authentication service provider or a state provider that we added, or no?
Okay, well, let's go take a look. I think I can leave that code since this builds.
Yeah.
Well, of course, we can always remove it later if we think it's a problem. But let's go back here. And now when you dive into add cascading authentication state, this is now their method. and it says it adds to the service collection.
Okay. And then line 24, get required service is trying to find an authentication state provider.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And it's just saying, well, where is it now? That makes me feel like there is some subtle difference between an app where you get this added and you don't. But I mean, I'm not sure. I don't think this has anything to do with it, but just for the heck of it, I'm going to add support for Blazor Server.
Okay.
Which we believe, after having dissected this, that's how you add, that's it. All you have to do.
Yeah.
And oh, you got to get your semicolons right. Okay, so now we got a different value. So that now it's complaining about when I tried to inject HTTP context. So let's take that back out. Let's take this out. So this is interesting. So we added the authentication state provider.
Yep.
The authentication state provider, this could be a clue. The authentication state provider didn't seem to do anything. But then we said, well, let's add in support for Blazor Server. Let's add that in. And now the app comes up.
What?
So what that,
okay.
So I will show you. So for people that are wondering what I keep looking at, previously I tried to do a Blazor 8 from scratch just on my own, and it went successful. But notice the big difference between when I tried it before is this is interactive auto essentially.
Yeah.
Right, because it's add everything.
It's got both. Yeah.
So that's telling me that add interactive server components, that is adding. Let's go check this out. If we dive into add interactive server components. Okay, first of all, it's a extension method. So you got to click again. You got to basically F12 through this as well to basically say, go to this definition. And now we find out what it's really doing. And when you add interactive server components, it adds server-side Blazor. Okay. And nothing else that really helps us too much here, I don't think. But we're going to find out what add server-side Blazor does, because it might do a lot more than we realize. Adds protected storage, add hub options. This is all to get the SignalR stuff going. Anti-forgery state provider.
Okay.
And here we go. Look at this.
Nice. Line 85.
Right. So the authentication state provider is an interactive component itself, is what it's telling me. See, that is that for server-side Blazor, you use the authentication state provider, and it's setting it up here. It's setting it up by figuring out, here's how I know. I don't know what this does from here on down. But like they say here, intended for use in server-side Blazor. So you don't get an authentication state provider unless you've picked either Blazor Server or Blazor WebAssembly. And I think that's actually extremely helpful. So when you're trying to do Blazor from scratch, this does not help you. The purpose of this, I believe, is to help you in interactive components, and maybe isn't even necessary if you're purely server based. But I'm going to tell you, I'm not sure. And that's why we're tearing this apart for folks who are wondering is, I'm tearing it apart partially because I'm naturally curious about things, but I don't want to make it look like, I really do try to do things with a purpose, which is to say, like, this is actually going to help me if I figure this out.
Yeah. This is good to know. It's not it's not superfluous knowledge, right? This is important to understand what's going on and why that control might work or might not work depending on how you've defined your render mode.
Right. So since the beginning of this, our plan was to not use. I mean, I think we were coming back to this. This was all layering, but to say the server side rendered Blazor. Let's take all this out. We already know now that we can't use that authentication state provider, which is going to be useful in a second. But it's not useful yet. So we don't even need this yet. I wonder if you can have an empty code block.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess, right? We don't need this yet, and we don't need this. Okay, so instead, let's try, remember, we're server side only. So now my question is, can I do this? Can I create a cascading parameter, and we'll make it public, although I don't know that it needs to be. Maybe it does. And it's a nullable HTTP context. And look, all this stuff is lighting up.
Yeah.
All that stuff lit up. Now, how the heck did it light up? Well, maybe we go to the global usings. And am I going to spot it real quick? I don't know. Maybe not. I don't. I mean, I guess here is I mean, is it SystemNet HTTP? No, it's ASP.NET Core HTTP, which is, I don't. Maybe it's one of these. Okay. So that builds.
But does it run?
Well, I think it's going to run, but we're not going to get a whole lot out of it just yet, but that's okay.
Yeah.
So this is pretty much back to scratch. We did not end up touching this because I took out the cascading authentication provider support. And so here's the app runs. Welcome to your new app.
Yep.
I want to investigate the user that's logged in though, which shouldn't be anybody. Like I'm fine with that if it's nobody. So the question now is, for me, is because I'm purely server side, and I don't know. I don't necessarily know if I expect this to work, but who cares? I suppose. Can I add this back? Nah, there's a little bit of trouble here. But I wonder.
You just got to change that to HTTP context, right?
Or do this.
Other way around. Yeah.
Saying it could be possibly null. Sure. And if it is null, I think we've discussed that that the Blazor markup is smart enough to deal with null and be like, yeah, it's not going to. Well, what are you complaining about here? Oh, interesting. Found markup element with unexpected name. Add a using directive. Okay. So we have to bring this back, which might have been here before. I think we got, when we added the authentication state provider, this came in.
Okay. I can see that.
So this component is in the same namespace. So now what my hope here is that we're actually not authorized. Because
that's what you would expect.
Right. So, but the idea is to get the foundation going. And look at this. No registered service of type, authentication policy provider. So that must mean that the interactive server components is doing us another favor and getting an authorization policy provider in place.
Yep.
So that it has something to figure out. Like it says, okay, you're not authenticated, but that I don't know what that means. Like MVC doesn't know what that means. So let's not, just for now, since we've only got about 10 minutes left, I think figuring out how to wire this up with an authorized view isn't the worst. It would be interesting to figure out.
Yeah.
Let's see. But let's just get rid of this and let's interrogate that. Well, actually, I don't want to get rid of all of it. let's interrogate that directly and say, okay. I actually don't know if that's going to render hello or if it's going to skip the whole tag. We're about to find out. Okay, so it did something funny. It rendered it, but
it
not
ignored
what I
the
would have
outside.
expected. Yeah, that's not what I would have expected. I think it's because actually I don't know why. I suppose we could set one of these and find out. Let's refresh this, and we get here context. So there is a context.
Huh.
Users not authenticated. Okay. And so identity name is null. So that's kind of what's happening here. Is authenticated is false.
Right.
So the name is null. That makes sense.
But there is a user object.
There is a user object, right?
And an identity.
Right.
It's just that the name is null.
So what we could do is we could
But then why didn't they just give us null?
I think this might be the reason.
Okay.
I think this might be the reason. Because
the exclamation?
Yeah, the C# little exclamation thing, which I don't know a lot of people are using. Let's see. It's got a name.
I thought that was just going to be a text exclamation. I didn't realize it had code implications.
Yes, the null forgiving operator.
Wow. Okay.
And not a lot of people use this, and I'm not even one of them who uses it really all that much.
Okay.
So a lot of people, I think, are aware of this one, right? Oh, you know what? I think I did this wrong. I think that's how you're supposed to do that, right? Then the Elvis operator? No, I guess not. I thought that was right, though. Is that if context? Okay, so let's get rid of this. I may have done this incorrectly, where this is supposed to say, I believe what this is saying, if context is null, then just return null. If user, we're not protecting ourselves. If identity is null, just return null. But if name is null, you get to the very end, the null forgiving operator.
Just a note.
Yeah, is testing. Like, let's see what they talk about here. So they're doing an example where they're saying you could create this test, but without the null forgiving operator, you can't convert the null literal to a non-nullable reference type. And so when you definitely know that an expression can't be null, but the compiler doesn't recognize that, you can put the exclamation mark. When Mads Torgensen described this operator, he used to call it the damn it operator. Like, I know that this is not going to be null, compiler.
Oh.
That's what he called it. He said you could also call this the damn it operator, which I think is funny. Because without it, you're going to get this warning that says, well, look, this might be null. Now, many people will ignore warnings, but what if you're the type of developer that enables warnings as errors? Now you're stuck. And so using the null forgiving operator, you're basically telling, you're basically saying suppress nullable warnings for that particular expression. It doesn't do anything at runtime. It can still blow up. It's just that you are suppressing warnings at compile time. And I honestly think the reason for it is because there are developers, and I'm actually kind of one of them. I like to turn on warnings as errors, and it drives me to get warnings out of there because early in the project, you have 1 and then 2 and then 3, and then a year in, you have 257.
Yes.
Yeah. So we've all been there? Okay.
I'm there right now.
Yeah. So let's see, now that I've done that, let's see if that changes things at all. I'm just curious. Okay. So this actually did a little bit more of what I wanted. I made a mistake in my Razor syntax, and I did not completely So another little joke about the question mark period is it's the Elvis operator because it looks like Elvis's little hairdo. If you turn
okay.
And this is the null, the percent. I'm sorry, the question mark. Here we go. The null coalescing operator. Nope, wrong one. Sorry. These operators are all. This is the one I want. No, I'm not right about that. There's the null forgiving operator. This is not it. I want the Elvis operator. So we're going to say, oh, I was hoping we'd find it. It's not the null coalescing operator. It's got a name. And, oh, I didn't even search for it correctly. Yeah, maybe I'm wrong. Anyways, let's go back to the docs and see. Ugh, that's not what I wanted at all. We were here on the null forgiving operator. List all C# operators. I don't know that that's going to make it easy to find. Well, I don't think it's in here, but it's when you are, oh, look at that. They do show it here. Null conditional operators. Oh, the naming. Okay. So this is the infamous Elvis operator, which when you are accessing a member, you're dotting along from object to something to something to something. That's probably the term. It could have been called like the null dotting along operator. When you're dotting along, if along your path, some of these things could be null, you can use the Elvis operator to say, if it's null, instead of trying to continue to access, which is going to be a null reference exception, just send null back up the stream. Stop here and send null back up.
Okay.
That's what that does. It can also be applied to elements of an array. Like I've got an object and if that object isn't null, it has elements. So I could access those elements with square braces. But if it is null, we're going to blow up. So therefore use the Elvis. It's not really an Elvis one now. Use the null conditional version of this and you're not going to blow up. You're just going to send null back up the string.
Okay.
I don't know if you use those a whole lot.
I do not, but that helps. So in this context, we actually have two, right?
Yes.
So it's saying if context is null, then that's fine. We're covered.
Back.
Yep. If the user object is null, we've got a problem. If the identity property is null, we're okay because it'll handle that. Okay.
Yep. So I think what we've discovered is user can't be null.
Yeah.
And I think that's true. And then because even when you don't have a user, you still have a user. They're just not authenticated.
You have an object.
So what's happening is we talked about how at runtime, that exclamation mark doesn't have any effect. So I think if I take this out, is it going to warn me? It's not going to warn me. Okay. So once again, let's just go ahead and run this. And what happens is Blazor steps in for us. It gets null back. And instead of blowing up, it just does no markup.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, it's not great, but it, that's how it works. So what I think we can do instead now is we can say if context, and maybe this isn't, I mean, we're in like the last couple minutes here. So who knows if this is the exact best way to do this. But if I say user.identity and then there was an is authenticated, right? Yep.
Yep.
And we could just kind of do, you know what's interesting here is you see how it's suggested?
Double. Yep.
Yeah. I feel like what it's saying is if this turns out, if the problem is authenticated isn't going to be null, but the identity could be.
Yeah. Which means you have to put the question mark there. Question period. Yep.
Okay. So I guess what it's telling you is we are testing to see if you're authenticated, but if you're not, if this comes back null, then return false.
No, it would be no. So that's true. So you're just checking if that's true or not.
Right.
If that statement is true. So if it's authenticated as false.
Right.
Do this.
Not that we know for a fact this isn't going to work anyway. Why are you hiding me here? Oh, I know. Let's put a p tag. And then we could theoretically do this.
Yep.
We're not going to be logged in today. However, I think next time we can talk about how we can, what we want to get to is real logins.
Mm-hmm.
But next time we can also talk about how to fake it too, because you can do that. I feel pretty confident that we're going to get back. Did I not need to do that? Okay. I didn't need to put razor syntax there.
Yeah.
We're going to get you are not authorized. All right. And then there's some dangling thing there. So you could argue in some sense that this is working.
Mm-hmm.
I find it interesting here. An X, there it is.
That's
There's
why.
an extra one of those. You could argue that this is working. I'm not going to say that this is the most useful thing because, and there's two reasons why. One is that I get the sense that like using the cascading authentication state provider is probably very helpful, but it doesn't help you server side.
Right.
So it just depends on it depends on where you want to take this authentication logic. And if you want that to be an interactive component.
Even though you're running server side.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
I don't have the answer to that question yet. Because where I want to land is where we have this about link. I want that experience that you get on a lot of web pages of user information's in the upper right. And if you're not logged in, it says sign in and you click there and you sign in right there. To me, that's a component.
I would agree. I was thinking the same thing.
What I don't know is, does it have to be an interactive component? And I think the answer is it doesn't have to be if you're willing to be server side, because we've had server side apps that do authentication for generations. So
yeah,
it doesn't have to be. So does this mean our final component that we end up building here may have to be like a little smarter than the average bear and go, it almost would have to know and figure out, let me check the HTTP context. Oh, that's null. Then I must be an interactive component. So let me check the authentication state provider. I don't know.
And would you do two controls or two components?
Right.
Right. And load the right component depending on whether you've got the context or not.
Yeah. That's interesting, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's even probably a better way to do it, is instead of it being smart, you can stay kind of dumb, or just more naive. And we'll have a host component that figures out which one to use.
Well, I mean, that's probably markup on the page, markup in the header.
Yeah. So I would understand if you watched today and felt like, wow, we didn't really get very far. But the deconstruction of authentication, I think, for a lot of people is really confusing. And I was even confused that I thought, well, let's add this cascading authentication provider. But then when you start going down the rabbit hole of what's really happening under the covers, as much as I really do love the model of extension methods that are written, that you write an extension method to make things easy for your users, or maybe we just use the ones that are built in, like that add cascading authentication. There was a little bit of fool's gold with it, in that without really deeply thinking about it, you ask yourself, why doesn't this work? Why didn't this line of code right here just work?
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, well, the reason it didn't work is because you need an authentication state provider. It's like, well, wait a second. How do I get one of those? Oh, well, it turns out that our friend here added one for you. That kind of magic can be infuriating if you just don't know what's going on, because you just like, I was here going like, wow, I don't know. Are we stuck? But it had to be something.
Yeah. And especially if you just jump in the docs, right? Because the docs say, hey, you need that authentication state provider but you really don't do it directly, right? It just kind of happens. So so there's some digging into that section there right above that.
Yep. And like it says here, this is very helpful. We tried to use the AuthorizeView component without it.
Yep.
It didn't work. So they're telling you, listen, AuthorizeView uses AuthenticationStateProvider. So that's interesting. And I have to wonder, what does this mean? Like they talk about, how do you implement an authentication state provider in server-side blob apps? Okay, fine. That just feels like it's time to read this article. So it's very interesting. So yeah, we're very already cool. A few minutes past 9, but
we are, yeah. And I do have a customer thing I got to run to.
Okay, sounds good. Well, listen, if you were watching, we got a great. I'm sorry that I did not look at Edson's comment here while we were working, but he was helping us out with the null, one of the versions of the null coalescing operator. So really appreciate that input. But as you can see, it's hard for me to know if this is super useful pragmatically. Mm-hmm. And as we start to build this up, I think we'll come to some conclusions. But I really have personally wanted to get to the bottom of how this works, mainly because we are in a component world now, not in a page world, a server-side page world. So that's it. I hope you all enjoyed it. I don't know if you were if you're gonna lead us out, then I was gonna turn it over to you.
No, go for it. I will just hit the music.
All right. Well, everybody, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate feedback. If you liked this show or if you have comments, please let us know in the comments down below. If you want to see more deconstruction like this, let us know. It's something that I'm very interested in. But if you're kind of the person that says like, can you just build an app? That's fine. We've got some apps to build too. So for Rich, I'm Chris, and thank you all for joining us. And we'll see you next time on the Dev Talk Show.